Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm Stephen Carroll, and this is Here's Why, where we take one news story and explain it in just a few minutes with our experts here at Bloomberg.
Every one of our jobs, at every stage of our careers, at every company, in every country is going to get affected by how this technology is going to change work. And so we all need to lean into it.
No technology in the history of technologies has ever reduced jobs on net. But it does change who is working and who's not and what skills are demanded.
Be aware of AI, adapt to AI, but also think about these problems of labor displacement. You know, I think pure market capitalism can be pretty brutal here.
There's a growing body of research trying to predict how artificial intelligence will change the labour market. Some say it's going to mean hundreds of millions of jobs are lost. Others believe the technology will create far more roles than it ultimately destroys. The change is happening quickly, but a report by the Economic Innovation Group think tank in the US recently concluded that the effects of AI aren't showing up in labour market data, at least for now. So here's why AI isn't taking your job yet. Bloomberg Opinion columnist Parmy Olson joins me now for more. Parmy, let's start with the potential that AI has to shake up the labour market first. Who is thought to be most exposed?
Well, I think because of the nature of the new generative AI tools that companies are so excited about, the likes of ChatGPT, they are very good at generating text, at processing lots of information. So the people who are most exposed are the ones who do that kind of work, the so-called knowledge workers. So people who work in the legal fields, in media, in research, anything that involves any kind of information processing or generating information is exposed. And that, I mean, if you kind of look at what that means in context, that actually means people who are highly educated. So one study showed that 27% of workers with a bachelor's degree are going to work in a job that's highly exposed to AI and potentially disruptive, whereas only 3% of people who don't even have a high school diploma are affected. So that's a big gulf in terms of who's exposed. And for many people, that will seem quite ironic. You spend all this money, educating yourself to only find yourself actually quite exposed to this new technology.
The potential for change is absolutely huge, and the conversation is happening everywhere. But what is the current data telling us about how AI is changing the jobs market?
So I think it's quite hard to kind of get a clear picture of that yet, because there are so many other economic factors that are also affecting the job market. There's inflation, there's high interest rates, there's all the geopolitical stuff that's happening. And so I think really right now what people can agree on is that AI is perhaps more of an accelerant than an actual cause to job disruption, people losing their jobs. There have been some studies that show there is a direct link between generative AI and layoffs, often because companies are attributing the layoffs to their use of greater use of generative AI. There was one study that showed in the first 7 months of 2024, 10,000 layoffs were linked to generative AI, and something like in the top 5 causes of workforce cuts, AI is up there in those top 5. And the other effect we're seeing is, of course, like a hiring freeze on entry-level workers, kind of repetitive roles, particularly in software, data management. So I think we're also in this kind of wait and see moment where companies are still experimenting with generative AI to see how they can use it to become more productive, potentially cut down on costs, cut down on labor costs. And so they're not necessarily cutting jobs. They're just not hiring new jobs until they can see if AI actually can be used instead of a human.
Do we see much difference between countries or industries when it comes to the effect that it's having?
The greater difference is actually just between industries. As I mentioned, the kind of knowledge work, areas like finance and law and media and IT, those are definitely industries that are very much affected. Even creative industries, who would have thought that, a few years ago? Whereas other industries which involve more human-to-human interaction or a physical trade, like construction or, caregiving, those are a bit more insulated. But in much the same way, when you talk about countries, in much the same way that, people with degrees tend to be more exposed, so too are more advanced economies, which rely on knowledge worker and the knowledge economy. Countries in Europe and North America are perhaps more exposed to those in developing economies, which rely on more on manufacturing and on services. So it's not like country by country, but certainly by regions, I think there is also that difference.
You've been writing in particular about how young workers are being affected by this as well. Yeah. What sort of things have you heard from them?
I think it's always tough for anyone entering the job market, for any young person entering. I mean, I remember when I was first looking for jobs 20 years ago, it was really, really hard, and you had to try all sorts of creative ways to put yourself out there. I almost feel like it is harder now for this current generation. And that is because companies are experimenting with AI, and the most exposed jobs aren't just the knowledge worker jobs, they're the entry-level jobs. And the reason for that is really simple. Companies are being advised to treat AI and ChatGPT like an intern or a research assistant. And that's exactly what they're doing. And they're doing that at the expense, in many cases, of real human interns or real human research assistants, because actually these tools do that work very, very well. That's where we're seeing some of the hiring freezes on this entry-level work. And when young people do get jobs at these companies in sort of white-collar jobs, they're expected to use AI on the job. And that's a whole other kind of story, because when you're using AI to do those first tasks, you're producing more quickly than perhaps someone in your role would have done 2 years prior. But are you being trained? Are you really learning the business fundamentals, the industry fundamentals? And I'll give you one example. I spoke to one young man who was working at a fintech company. He had an accountancy degree, and he was doing due diligence on companies. And, 3 years ago, someone in his role would have been reading Moody's reports and Companies House reports and analyst reports and just looking for those red flags to do the due diligence. What he was doing was taking all that text and putting it into ChatGPT, and it was doing that analysis for him. The great thing for his employer was he was producing something much more quickly than he would have done. The bad thing for him is he's not gaining that skill, kind of those neural connections to spot or to read those reports and kind of know what to look for. Young workers are in this weird situation now where they're actually not only being asked to do work more quickly, but kind of do more higher level strategic work because the AI is doing all this so-called grunt work. But I question whether you can make that leap without doing that grunt work first, and what this next generation of office workers and professionals, what kind of grounding they have when they're letting AI do so much of the cognitive work for them.
And that's a really interesting thing to think about as the technology gets rolled out into more areas as well. I do want to think about, I suppose, citing this in a historical context as well. I mean, this isn't the first major technological shift that we've seen in the workplace, far from it.
Of course.
What have we learned from the past pivotal moments for where tech has gotten involved in the workforce that might give us an idea of how this is all going to pan out?
Well, in the past, these kinds of transitions actually happen very slowly, which is odd to say because I think right now this current transition with AI is happening very quickly. And I think it's going to happen more quickly than previous transitions had. So just for example, the 1980s, when companies who were previously doing everything on printed paper and faxes and telephone calls and handwritten notes, all of a sudden they were using computers. That was a huge, very painful, very complicated transition to suddenly put everything in digital form on a computer. Sort of the same, I suppose you could say, with the move to cloud. And so that takes time because a company has all these different processes and ways of working, and you have to transition that to this new environment. And I think with AI, we'll see something similar. It's funny because right now AI companies are just absolutely falling over themselves to make the biggest model, the smartest AI. And what they failed a little bit at doing is really talking to their customers, their enterprise customers, and just helping them figure out how to use these tools in their own businesses and in their own processes. And so there's been this difficult, I think businesses have really struggled. This is this incredible technology. How do we actually use it? So even if AI didn't progress at all anymore, I think we'd still have another 5-10 years ahead of us for businesses just to figure out how to exploit, how to capitalize on this technology. So I think we're in the early days of that, and probably like in the next 3 to 5 years or so, we'll see a bit more of an acceleration as companies really start to figure out how to use these tools, and I hate to say it, but like replace some of their own workers with some of these tools, and maybe even create new types of jobs that involve AI.
So much more to come on this topic, but for now, Parmy Olson, Bloomberg Opinion columnist, thank you. And you can read more from Parmy at bloomberg.com/opinion. And for more explanations like this from our team of 3,000 journalists and analysts around the world, go to bloomberg.com/explainers. I'm Stephen Carroll. This is Here's Why. I'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.